21, my Amish wife waited for me on our wedding night. I was in the barn with my father. Don't go to her yet. That's what my father said to me on my wedding night. November dark. Cold enough that the water in the barn trough had a skin of ice on it, thin as paper, and I remember pressing my thumb through it just to feel something crack. Rebecca was inside the house, my bride, my wife of 6 hours. Sitting at the edge of the bed her mother had made up with the good quilt, the one with the 9-patch pattern in blue and wine. And I was in the barn, kneeling on frozen straw next to our best draft horse, a Percheron named Gideon, whose left foreleg had swelled up so thick it looked like a fence post wrapped in hide. My father had his hands, and I need to tell you about his hands because that's where the whole story lives. His hands were cracked across every knuckle, stained dark from walnut hull and iron water, and they were pressing a comfrey poultice into that leg with a gentleness I had never once seen him use on a human being. The kerosene lamp on the nail above us hissed and sputtered, throwing our shadows big across the wall. I could smell the poultice, hot, green, almost sweet like fresh-cut hay left in the rain, and my father, without looking up, said the thing I didn't understand until I was 41 years old. He said, "A man who can't heal what depends on him has no business lying down beside a wife." I was 19. Quick pause. My name is Joseph, and this is Rebecca's husband. If these stories stay with you, if they remind you of something the old ones knew, subscribe. It's free, and it's the reason I can keep telling them. Tell me in the comments, did anyone in your family have a remedy they refused to let die? Something they made with their hands that no pharmacy ever carried. And if you want to go further, a super chat or a membership, that's you telling me these old ways are worth remembering. That keeps this going. Now, back to what happened. You have to understand something about where I come from or none of this will make sense. In our community, Old Order, Lancaster County, the kind of plane where your buggy doesn't even have a slow-moving vehicle triangle on the back, healing wasn't something you went somewhere to get. It was something that lived in the house, in the root cellar, in the jars on the top shelf of the pantry that nobody labeled because everybody already knew. My gross-daddy, my father's father, Amos, he could look at a plant growing along the fence row and tell you what it would fix. Not because someone taught him in a classroom, because his mother showed him when he was 5 years old, walking the edge of the hayfield after first cutting, and he never forgot. That's how it moved, not through books. Through hands and feet, and the smell of something drying on a windowsill in September. The Brousher, the healer, he came when things got bad, when a fever wouldn't break or a wound went dark. But before the Brousher, before the English doctor, before anyone outside the family even knew something was wrong, there was the kitchen, there was Ma'am, there was Dat, there was whatever grew within walking distance of the back door. And there was a belief so deep, nobody even called it belief. They just called it what you do. I almost asked about it once. I was maybe 12. Dat was grinding dried yarrow flowers in the small wooden mortar Grossdaddy had carved from a piece of cherry. You could still see the grain running red through it, smooth from decades of use. I watched him pour the powder into a square of cheesecloth and fold it like he was wrapping something sacred. I opened my mouth to say, "Why don't we just go to the doctor in town?" But I didn't. Not because I was afraid of him, because of the way his jaw was set, the way his eyes were focused on that little square of cloth, like the rest of the world didn't exist. You don't interrupt a man in the middle of something he learned from his father. That's not a rule anyone writes down. That's a rule you feel in your chest. And I swallowed the question, and I carried it, and I'm still not sure I've ever fully let it go. My father's name was Eli Lapp. He was not a big man, 5'8", maybe 160 soaking wet, but he had a kind of stillness to him that made him seem larger than the room. He married my mother, Anna, when he was 20 and she was 18, and by the time I came along, the third of 6, they had already buried one child. A girl, Ruth. She lived 11 days. I didn't learn that until I was almost grown, because in our house, grief was something you folded up and put away like a winter coat in April. You didn't take it out and show people. Dat told me about Ruth exactly once, sitting on the bench outside the milk house, and when he finished he said, The Lord gives and the Lord takes, and a man doesn't ask why more than once. Then he stood up and went back to work, and I carried that. I carried the way his voice didn't shake. I carried the way he rubbed the callus on his right thumb, over and over, like he was trying to wear down something harder than skin. It was Dat who taught me about comfrey, not in a lesson, not sitting down. He taught me the way Amish fathers teach everything, by letting you stand close enough to watch. Comfrey grew thick along the south side of our barn, the barn with the second beam he'd had to brace after the ice storm of— no, wait, it wasn't an ice storm, it was the windstorm. February of '94. I get those mixed up sometimes. The comfrey came back every spring like it had unfinished business with that patch of ground. Big, rough, hairy leaves. Dat would cut them early in the morning when the dew was still on them, and he'd say the same thing every time. Knit bone. That's what the old ones called it, because it knits what's been broken. He said it like a man reading scripture. And in a way, I think for him it was. The week before my wedding, everything was preparation, not just for the ceremony, for the life. In our tradition, the wedding happens at the bride's family home. Rebecca's parents, Levi and Martha Stoltzfus, had a farm about 4 miles east of ours, and the whole community had been cooking and cleaning for days. 300 people expected. Celery, we grew rows and rows of it, because celery is what you serve at an Amish wedding, and everyone in the district knows you're getting married when they see the celery growing tall in your garden. Rebecca and I had been announced, by the bishop 2 Sundays before. But while all that was happening in the world of people and plans, something else was happening in the barn. Gideon, our best horse, the one Dad had raised from a foal, the one who pulled the family buggy and never once spooked at a passing truck. Gideon had stepped wrong in the pasture. A groundhog hole, we think. His left front leg swelled overnight, hot to the touch, and by the Tuesday before the wedding, he could barely put weight on it. Dat didn't say much about it, he just got quiet, quieter than usual, which is saying something for a man who already used words like they cost money. The night of the wedding, a Thursday late November, the singing and the dinner and the sitting together, all of it had gone the way it was supposed to. Rebecca looked. I don't have the right words for how she looked. I'm not a man who talks like that. But I'll say this. She wore the blue dress she'd made herself, and her hands were steady when mine weren't. And when we sat together at the corner table, the Eck, we call it, she leaned over and whispered, "You're shaking, Joseph." And I was. Not from the wedding, from what I'd seen in the barn that morning. Gideon's leg had gotten worse. The swelling had gone hard. Dat had pressed the back of his hand against the skin, and I watched his face change. Just for a second, just a flicker around his eyes, and then it went flat again. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. A horse like Gideon, in our world, isn't a pet. He's how you get to church. He's how you get to market. He's how you bring the doctor when someone's dying. Losing Gideon would have been like losing the use of your own legs, and Dat knew it, and I knew he knew it, and neither of us said a word about it at my wedding. After the last guests had gone to their buggies and the lanterns were being put out one by one across the Stoltzfus property, Dat found me in the kitchen. He was still in his good coat, the mutza with the hook and eye closures, and he had that look, the one where his mouth was a straight line and his eyes were somewhere else entirely. "Komm mit," he said. "Come with me." That's all, and I followed him. I followed him out the back door of my in-laws' house, across the yard where the frost was already coming down white on the grass, past the smokehouse, and into the barn where Gideon stood in his stall, holding that left leg up off the ground like it belonged to someone else. Rebecca was upstairs, waiting. In the room her mother had prepared for us, and I was pulling on my barn coat and kneeling on frozen straw because my father needed me and a horse needed us. And that is what you do when you come from where I come from. Dat had already heated the water. He'd already cut the comfrey, a whole armload of those big rough leaves, and he was mashing them in the dented tin pot he kept on the shelf above the harness hooks. The smell hit me the second I walked in, green, alive, almost like the earth itself had opened up and breathed into that barn. He added something else. I didn't know what it was then. A dark liquid from a brown bottle with no label. Later, years later, I'd learn it was a tincture of Solomon's seal root. something Gross-Daddy Amos had made every fall and stored in the cellar like other men store wine. Dat poured it into the mash without measuring. He just knew, the way you know how much salt goes in bread if you've made it 1,000 times. He showed me how to hold the leg. Not grip it, hold it. Like you're holding a child's hand, he said. Firm enough they know you're there, gentle enough they're not afraid. And I held Gideon's leg while my father packed that hot, wet, green-black poultice around the swelling, layer by layer, his cracked fingers pressing it smooth, the way a plasterer smooths a wall. Gideon flinched once. Dat put his other hand flat on the horse's neck and said something low in Deitch, Pennsylvania Dutch, that I couldn't quite hear. It wasn't a prayer, not exactly. It was more like, give me a second. It was more like what you'd say to a child who's scared of the dark. Just sounds, just presence. And then he wrapped the whole thing in a long strip of cotton feed sack, the kind with the tiny blue flowers printed on it, which I remember because it seemed so out of place against the blood and the swelling and the smell of an animal in pain. Now we wait, Dat said. And he sat down on the milking stool and he didn't move. And I sat down on the barn floor and I didn't move either. And Rebecca waited. And the clock in the Stoltzfus kitchen ticked past midnight. Here's the part I didn't understand for a long time. What my father did that night, it wasn't just about the horse. I mean, it was. Gideon needed that poultice, and without it, the swelling might have gone to infection, and an infection in the leg of a draft horse in 1997 on a farm with no truck and no trailer, and the nearest English vet 20 miles away. That's not a small thing. That's a disaster wearing a quiet face. But there was something else Dat was teaching me, and he never once said it out loud. He was showing me that a man's first night as a husband doesn't begin in a bedroom. It begins wherever something is suffering, and he has the knowledge to help. He was showing me the remedy, not just the comfrey, not just the Solomon's seal. The whole thing, the way you heat the water, the way you hold the leg, the way you sit in silence and wait for the medicine to do what the medicine does. He was passing it to me, and I didn't even know I was receiving it. Neither of us talked about what it cost. Rebecca never said a word about it. Not that night, not the next morning, not in 27 years of marriage. She understood. She grew up the same way I did. She knew that when a man's father says, "Come with me," you go. But I'll tell you what I learned later, what I wish I'd known then. There was a moment, maybe around 1 in the morning, when Rebecca came downstairs in her night clothes and stood at the barn door. I didn't see her. Dat didn't see her. She told me this years afterward, sitting at our own kitchen table, peeling apples for sauce, and she said it so quiet I almost missed it. She said, "I stood there and watched you both." And I thought, that's the kind of man I married. And I went back inside. She wasn't angry. She was, I don't know what to call what she was. Proud isn't the right word. Settled, maybe. Like something she'd hoped for had been confirmed, and I carried that. By morning, the swelling had gone down by half. I checked it before the sun came up, pressed the back of my hand against Gideon's leg the way I'd watched Dat do it, and the heat was less. Not gone, but less. Like a fever that's broken, but hasn't fully released its grip. Dat came in behind me, still in his barn coat, and I don't think he'd slept at all. He looked at the leg, he looked at me, he nodded once. That was it. That was all the celebration we got. He mixed a second poultice, fresh comfrey, more of that dark Solomon's seal tincture, a handful of dried plantain leaf he kept in a cloth bag hung from a nail, and we packed the leg again. 3 days we did this. 3 days of morning and evening applications, of sitting in that cold barn and waiting, of watching a horse slowly decide to put weight on his own leg again. By the 4th morning, Gideon walked to the water trough on his own, and Dat said, "I remember this exactly." He said, "See, the land doesn't lie. What grows knows what to fix." And then he went inside for breakfast like nothing extraordinary had happened. I stood there in the barn alone, 19 years old, married 4 days, and I thought, I just learned something that nobody in any school is ever going to teach me. I didn't know what to call it yet, but I felt it in my hands, the warmth of it, the weight. That remedy, the comfrey and Solomon's seal poultice, became mine after that. Not officially. Nothing in our world is official except what the bishop says on Sunday. But it became mine the way a song becomes yours after you've sung it enough times. I used it on our plow horse 2 years later when she strained a tendon pulling stumps. I used it on my own knee after I fell from the haymow and landed wrong. Couldn't bend it for a week until I swallowed my stubbornness and made the poultice myself, kneeling on the kitchen floor at 11 at night while Rebecca stood in the doorway with her arms crossed and said, "You should have done that 3 days ago." She was right. She was usually right about the remedies. The women in our community, I need to say this, they carried more of the healing knowledge than the men ever did. Ma'am knew things about red clover and chamomile and wild cherry bark that Dat never learned. Rebecca's grandmother, old Sarah Stoltzfus, had a tea for croup that she made from mullein leaves and raw honey and a pinch of something she'd never tell anyone, took it to her grave, whatever it was. I used to joke that the women were the doctors and the men were just the ones strong enough to hold the horse still. That's not far from the truth. Not far at all. I wasn't the only man carrying a remedy. That's what I want you to understand. This wasn't just my family. At a barn raising 4 summers after my wedding, I was working the frame alongside my neighbor, Daniel King. Good man. Quiet like most of us. Hands like leather. We were fitting a beam into a mortise joint when he slipped and drove a splinter the length of a finish nail into the meat of his palm, right below the thumb. Blood everywhere. Somebody ran for a cloth. And Daniel's father, old Abram King, walked over with a tin of something in his coat pocket, didn't hurry, didn't panic, and he packed that wound with a paste that smelled like turpentine and garlic and something darker, something earthy, and he wrapped it with a strip torn from his own shirt. I said, "What is that?" And Abram looked at me with those pale blue eyes. The man was 70 if he was a day, and he said, "Same thing my father used, same thing his father used. That's all, 7 words." And Daniel went back to work 20 minutes later. I never did find out exactly what was in that tin. I asked Daniel once, years later, and he shrugged and said, "I think there's garlic in it, and maybe golden seal. I don't ask." That's how it was. You didn't ask. You just trusted that the ones who came before you had already done the asking. But there was one story I heard that stayed with me longer than the others. A man named Levi Byler, not Rebecca's father, a different Levi, from the next district over. He told me this at a Sunday meal after church, both of us sitting on the bench outside because the house was too crowded and too warm. His daughter, Katie, had burned her arm on the wood stove when she was 4. Bad burn. The kind where the skin goes white and then red and then something worse. His wife wanted to call for the English doctor. Levi wanted to call for the Brauker, old Hennerzook, who lived alone at the end of Hollander Road and who people said could stop blood and draw fire from a burn with nothing but his hands and his words. They called the Braucher. Henner came, he sat beside that little girl, and he held his hands over the burn, not touching, just hovering, and he murmured something nobody in the room could hear. 3 times he blew across the wound. Levi said the child stopped crying almost immediately. By morning, the redness had pulled back like a tide going out. Levi told me this, and then he went quiet for a long time, and finally he said, "I don't understand it. I'm not sure I'm supposed to." 4 winters later, old Henner Zook died in his sleep, and as far as I know, he never passed that particular gift to anyone. Whatever words he carried, they went into the ground with him, the thing that finally named what I'd been carrying, what Dat gave me in that barn, what Gross-Daddy Amos put into those brown bottles, what old Henner Zook whispered over a burned child's arm. It came to me on an ordinary Tuesday. I was 41. I was in the barn, ironically enough, cleaning harness leather with neat's foot oil, and the radio, we don't have electricity, but I had a small battery radio I kept on the shelf, which the bishop tolerated as long as I didn't bring it into the house. A program came on. An Englishwoman talking about something called traditional plant medicine, and she used a word I'd never heard before. She said ethnobotany, the study of how cultures use plants to heal. And she described, in her English university voice, with her English university words, exactly what my father did. Exactly what Gross-Daddy Amos did. Exactly what every quiet, plain-dressed man and woman in my community had been doing for 300 years without ever needing a word for it. My hands stopped moving on the leather. I just stood there. I felt something crack open in my chest. Not pain, not quite. More like a door I didn't know was closed. For the boy who knelt on frozen straw at 19 and didn't understand why his father chose a horse over a wedding bed, it was this. It had always been this: the land doesn't lie. What grows knows what to fix. And the people who live close enough to the ground to listen, they know things the rest of the world is just now starting to remember. I sat down on the barn floor, same barn, same cold concrete under the straw, and I thought about Dat. He'd been gone 5 years by then. Heart gave out at 63. No, wait, he was 62. Dat always told me to get that right, even about things that didn't matter, and I think age was one he'd have cared about. I thought about his hands pressing comfrey into a horse's leg by lamplight. I thought about Gross Daddy Amos walking the fence row, pointing at plants like he was introducing me to old friends, and I grieved. Not the sharp kind, the slow kind, the kind that sits in your chest like a stone you've swallowed and can't quite cough up. I grieved for every remedy that died with someone who never wrote it down. I grieved for old Henner Zook's words, lost now. I grieved for whatever was in Abram King's tin. I tried once to explain this to an English friend, a man I do business with at the hardware store in town, and he listened politely and then said, "So it's like herbal medicine?" And I said, "No, it's like," and I couldn't finish the sentence, because it's not like anything. It's not a category. It's a way of being alive. It's knowing that the earth is not just dirt under your boots. It's a pharmacy, and a scripture, and a grandfather's voice all at once. And if you didn't grow up with your hands in it, I don't know how to make you understand. That loneliness of standing between two worlds, one that feels it in the bones and one that wants a study and a name for it, that's something I carry every single day. But here's what I won't do. I won't pretend it was all good or all bad, because it was neither. It was both. 3 gifts I carry from that life, and I'll carry them until they put me in the ground. The first, the smell of comfrey steeping in hot water on a January night, green and alive in the middle of everything dead and frozen, and knowing that life insists on itself, even when the world says otherwise. The second, the sound of my father's voice saying, "Hold it like you're holding a child's hand," which is the only medical instruction I have ever needed, and the only one that has never failed me. The third, the taste of cold spring water from the hand pump behind our house, drawn up from the limestone aquifer that had been feeding that land since before any of us were born, water so cold it made your teeth ache, and so clean it tasted like the word mercy sounds. I am homesick for things I still live inside of. I still farm. I still keep the faith. But I carry questions now that the boy on the barn floor didn't have, and I've made my peace with the fact that the questions might be the most honest thing about me. The truth is this: wisdom doesn't need a diploma. It needs dirt under its fingernails, and a willingness to kneel. My father knelt beside a horse on my wedding night and handed me an inheritance no lawyer could have drawn up. Comfrey and Solomon's seal and silence and steadiness, and the plain, quiet knowledge that healing is not something you buy, it's something you become. I'm still becoming it, and I hope, I'm passing it to my own sons the same way Dat passed it to me, not by telling them, by letting them stand close enough to watch. If you grew up somewhere your grandfather's hands knew more than the doctor's diploma, I see you. If you carry a remedy in your memory that no one else in your life would understand, the way a leaf was folded, the way a tea was steeped, the color of something in a jar that had no label, I see you. And what you carry is not outdated. It is not superstition. It is not quaint. It is 300 years of people paying attention to the ground beneath their feet, and that is worth more than I have language for. You don't need a study to validate what your grandmother already proved at the kitchen table. If you're still inside the community and you're quiet about what you know, I see you. If you left and you missed the smell of the root cellar in August, the damp stone and the dried herbs hanging from the ceiling, and the cool dark that felt like the earth was holding you, I see you. If you're English and something in this story pulled at a thread you didn't know was loose, I see you. If your grandfather knew a remedy he never wrote down and now he's gone and the remedy went with him, I see you. And if you lost someone that modern medicine couldn't save, and you wonder sometimes if the old ways might have, I won't answer that. But I see you. Wherever you are in this, I see you. And you are not alone. Tell me in the comments, what remedy did your family carry? What did your grandmother make that no store ever sold? I want to hear it. I want to know that these things are still alive somewhere, in someone's hands, in someone's memory. There is so much more I haven't said yet. There are remedies I haven't been ready to share, but I'm getting closer. If you want to be here when I do, subscribe to Rebecca's Husband. This is where the old ways get a voice. And if a super chat or a membership feels right to you, that's you saying these stories matter, and that's all I need to keep going. The land doesn't lie, and neither will I. Your healing was never primitive. It was ahead of its time.